Hello, this is our final video in the small series that we have on the artist as political commentator. And in this one I speak with the composer John Harbison about his music, specifically about his cello sonata Abu Ghraib that we'll be performing in this concert, and about some of the political questions in the context of musical history. As I've said, as the curator of this program, I do not offer this as a political statement. And I remind you, it was created many, many months ago, almost 2 years ago, before this era of heightened political sensitivity in which we find ourselves. The intention of this programming is more to raise questions than it is to provide answers. I find it remarkable that this music exists in our literature. It's remarkable that it's there. And I asked John, why?
In the next time in our country, we are going to have to think a lot about whether the artist goes down his leafy path in sort of a we will preserve our bubble and our sanctuary, or whether we will engage more than we have in the daily world. And I think that we have to decide to engage more, just as everyone has that decision to make. The big task and adventure, really, of the presenter in today's musical culture is getting potential listeners excited about the idea of being there, of making the distinction between being there and getting it some other way.
Yeah.
And the being there experience carries with it both the likelihood of reacting strongly, but also the possibility. And the idea that the voice of the listener counts, particularly with new pieces, I think is exciting once you get across the fact that that's part of what's opened up.
Right.
So in a case where you add into that certain kinds of, shall we say, completely non-unanimous ideas in the culture, you are even further inviting people to react. We don't need gimmicks. We don't need to be giving away prizes and stuff. We need ideas about really right from whether the art should exist or not to what sorts of subjects can be treated. And I think we're going to find in the next few years, I'm sure, a rise in interest in presenting pieces of music which are not only good pieces of music, but which can encourage people to think about how they're leading their lives.
One of the questions we ask ourselves as presenters or performers or composers is, why do you come to concerts? Why do audience members show up to concerts? Is it to engage in this mildly soporific reproduction of your CD collection? Or is it because you want to engage with something that you're going to find on occasion is going to be rewarding and disturbing and challenging emotionally? If it's the former, you should definitely not show up to this next set of concerts. If it's the latter, no matter what side of the fence you find yourself on, this is going to be a remarkably rewarding experience for you.
So I wrote a piece some years ago called Between Two Worlds, in which I took up two kind of issues which interested me very much in terms of actually some things that I've been doing with my life, but the racial situation and the Vietnam War. And that was very flammable. I remember we performed that at our festival in Token Creek, and people in the audience, I would have thought an audience that would share some of my views, but no, they grabbed me and said, "How dare you shove your rotten political views down our throats?" You know, we paid our $25 or whatever, and we had to listen to this
Right.
And it was actually my words. It was words by Robert Bly and by a 15th century mystical philosopher. Yeah. But nevertheless, it apparently had a tremendously irritating force in the times in which it was introduced. I had really resisted dealing with race, first of all, because I think for a non-minority composer, it's a kind of awkward position, but also because I took part in the 1964 summer, and I didn't want to exploit having been there as a sort of claim of authority, because I didn't think I had any more.
I want you to be more specific, because I don't know where it was.
And I was one of those who went down to Mississippi in a kind of a disrupting force, which is trying to hasten the change of the racial situation there. And this piece, this particular Between Two Worlds, somewhat obliquely but unmistakably deals with those kinds of issues, among others. And I really felt sympathy for the audience in a way, because if they came to that concert with very different views, they would have felt that they were trapped. I was incredibly grateful as a composer, not for the sort of hostility, but really for the reactivity.
Right. Because
I thought, well, I've come to feel over really being around music a long time that's always a signal for something, that people have been listening, and people take the fact that these are important questions quite seriously.
One of the things John has said is that before anything else, the piece has to be good. Frequently, in response to events or situations, we find artistic expression launched immediately thereafter. And I think the message can become ineffective at that time. I think what you see with the works as we're performing in this program are artists' artistic expressions that have sat within the soul or the psyche of these composers before they found their way onto paper. And I think no matter, when you look into the history of music, from its beginnings, you realize that in this form, we have the truest record of who we are as a race. This is an emotional history that can't be rewritten by the victor. It is, I think, the truest record of who we are as humans.
In our concert music tradition, a lot of work which stakes out certain kinds of positions, certainly about how people treat each other. A huge amount, however you come at the theology of Bach cantatas, so much of their text is about how we live, how we treat other people, what the consequences are of treating each other badly, or of fighting, or making war. And there have been, of course, statements against war over and over. It doesn't change whether or not there are going to be wars. It just changes perhaps how we think about them. From Joseph Haydn and of course Beethoven's peculiarly hard to interpret statements about Napoleon. I mean, Mozart, when he wrote Marriage of Figaro, was picking up on a subject that he knew was always heard politically. The Beaumarchais play was a real broadside against the power of the nobles and a certain kind of moral of behavior in society and so forth. You can say he somewhat softened it, he and Da Ponte, but really the basic message is completely clear. And if you were an upper crust, big shot, that piece would be right in your gut. Shostakovich's appeal, which to me is a bit of a surprise. He is like the most surviving composer from the late part of the 20th century. And I wouldn't have been able to guess that in the late part of the 20th century. But I think part of it is that so much of his music seems to have a sort of subtone of his answer to the society he lives in.
Right.
And I think that the interest of that draws psychologically a lot of listeners
Right.
towards his work. I've been drawn back towards a Schoenberg piece called the Ode to Napoleon, which is a piece where he sets a rather crazy, zany, but very clear Byron poem against tyranny. Of course, Schoenberg himself wrote the first post-Holocaust and first, and in a way, the most effective of all, because it's almost like it's journalistically on the spot. He survived from Warsaw, for which he wrote his own text. And if anyone was somehow culturally central enough to do that, that was him. The thing that appealed to me about the Abu Ghraib at the time was it seemed to me to have opened up a topic for discussion which to me surprised me that it had been so consistently. There's obviously an international treaty involved there too, of course, but torture had been off the board for a long time. And then, of course, in the gradual reacting to Abu Ghraib as a situation, Errol Morris's film came out, a huge amount of journalism, we sort of caught up to the subject, and the president came in and said, we're not going to do that. That's, we made a big mistake. Then, to my amazement, in the course of this campaign, it went right back on the table. And we had people who were ready to take over the government who said, oh, no, torture, we're back there, we're on it. We think it's great, very effective, etc. That amazed me in that same way that the perennialness of certain subjects is part of the shock. There's something about it which I think we as human beings can grasp.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we regard wrongly, I guess, as a vestige of another more barbaric time. But of course, we learn over and over that we can't really be too sure about barbaric times having passed. When the piece was done in Europe, I was dismayed that that side of the piece dominated so much the impression. That is to say, the appetite for political statement in the arts in Germany is much greater than it is in the United States. So that there was, I would say, a strong urge to discuss the piece's so-called political side, and not very much what I took to be the shading involved in how it's actually presented in the piece.
Right.
And I think that's really a cultural difference. And in a certain peculiar way, it was good for the piece in that it was sort of headlines. But from my standpoint, that was not really what I thought was the most useful thing about the piece, which is much more to say that not only is there a horror, but there's then the struggle to find a way to live with the horror. And that's really what I wanted to set up in the piece. One of the reasons that I decided this last half of each movement of Abu Ghraib was going to not continue to hammer the actual drama, the physical drama of the subject, but sort of look at it from another angle, was that I felt that it's almost like the old religious pictures of the crucifixion, the hammering in of nails. People don't really stand for 55 minutes and look at those in a gallery. Well, Beethoven thought and talked about politics more than almost any composer, but he was tremendously optimistic, by nature. His whole idea was that real Enlightenment idea that we were marching gradually forward towards a more just society. And he had this amazing sort of socialist ideas that, instead of people making more money than others, the ones who had much would all just go in and sort of make donations. People who had less would all come in and just take what they need. That's always appealed to me immensely about his character. It was very, in a way, naive, but I think what he saw when he reacted specifically to politics, usually in protest against somebody who was going bad, who was turning into a dictator or something like that. I think his vision was that the world was going to become more just, and that rulers were going to be less rulers. The whole hierarchical feudal kind of thing, which was still around but fading in his time, was going to fade out. And that really his assertion always seemed to come out on the side of people would drop their grievances and their differences and so forth. So I think one of the reasons that he always inspires is that he totally believed this.
Right.
And he believed it out of a personal life which couldn't have been more disorganized and incredibly riddled by the most dislocating personal problems.
Right.
It is torture to relive his life. The daily cost of his just getting through the day was amazingly high. And you come out with even more amazement at his resilience, because what he wanted was to come out and feel that there was a way through. And he said it over and over in the pieces, but you have to be very dauntless of spirit even to read through it with him, because I can't imagine fighting that many daily battles and still coming out wanting to write the Ninth Symphony. I mean, it's perfectly astounding that he didn't become a very dark-hued, pessimistic, navel-looking composer is a great testament to his chemistry, to the way he was made, but also to the way he insisted to be. His temperament was such that really his own roadblocks were set up both by himself and people around him. And it's against that. It's amazing that his final conclusion seemed constantly to be that people were going to get along better, and they were going to treat each other better, and that the world would somehow solve most of its problems, which, of course, there wasn't tremendously more evidence in his time than any other time. But I think that was something that he was not equivocating, that he really thought it. And he was a really genuine intellectual. He read a lot. He thought about what great sort of thinkers had said about these things, and out of all this he came to very, very consistent conclusions, which is why the characteristic Beethoven deep sort of troubling thing goes towards apotheosis.
And so perhaps we here have an answer to some of the questions provoked by this program. Certainly, as to what John just said, that one of the reasons I concluded the program with this mighty Beethoven string quartet is that sense of apotheosis at its conclusion, at the concert's conclusion. Hope, optimism. I share with Beethoven those ideals, those aspirations. I share with Beethoven a belief in the essential goodness of people. And no matter what is provoked within you as we move through the music in this concert, I hope at its conclusion, as Beethoven's final chords hang in the auditorium, I hope that's the feeling that will be your companion as you journey home.